Welcome to take 3 of the joint 3-part transatlantic speaker series of Indiana University and Bavarian American Academy. My name is Andrea Adamor. I'm the director of the Indiana University Europe Gateway in Berlin, Germany. And I'm very glad to be here today with all of you and to welcome you to our second session of our joint speaker series in cooperation with the BAA. This virtual speaker series called Take 3 IU-Bavarian Talks brings together scholars from Indiana University and the Bavarian American Academy networks and institutions to spotlight the breadth of joint transatlantic research expertise. I want to thank my colleagues at the BAA, especially Marga Schweiger-Wilhelm, but her entire team who have made this event possible today. And of course, all my support at Indiana University at the Europe Gateway and beyond. Before we start with tonight's event, I want to introduce our 3 speakers to you. We have with us tonight Jan Seidler-Ramirez, Miriam Zadov, and Ed Linenthal. They will have a conversation on the topic of Minefields of Remembrance tonight. And we want to invite you, our audience, to have a conversation with them later on in the evening. Please send us your questions in the chat on YouTube or send us an email if you wish later tonight. So with that, I want to introduce first Jan Seidler-Ramirez. Jan is the founding chief curator and executive vice president of collections at the National September 11 Memorial and Museum in New York City. Under her guidance, the Memorial Museum's collection has grown to include many thousands of objects, artworks, photographs, films, oral histories and audio artifacts, architectural relics, and other primary evidence materials relevant to 9/11. Prior to that 2006 appointment, she served as a vice president and museum director at the New York Historical Society. Jan holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University. Miriam Zadov has been director of the Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism since May 2018. Miriam studied in Vienna, received her doctorate, and qualified as a university lecturer in Munich and held guest professorships and fellowships in Zurich, Berkeley, Berlin, and Augsburg. From 2014 to the summer of 2019, she held the Alvin H. Rosenfeld Chair in Jewish Studies and was professor of modern history at Indiana University, Bloomington. And this is when Miriam and I first met. Miriam is the author of numerous articles and the monographs, The Red Job, The Life of Werner Scholem, and next year in Marianne's Gelasne, Counterworlds of Jewish Cultures of Modernity. And these works have been translated in several languages. And last but not least, it's my pleasure to introduce Edward Linenthal. Ed is Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. He has a PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and taught and pursued his interdisciplinary research interests at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, the MIT, and of course, Indiana University. Ed has written widely on controversial historic sites in the US and on memorial processes, including books on the creation of the US Holocaust Museum and the Oklahoma bombing. He has also been a consultant for the National Park Service and for a decade served on the Flight 93 Memorial Commission. Most recently, he has worked with American and Norwegian colleagues tasked with memorializing those murdered in the 2011 terrorist attacks in Norway. It's my great pleasure to welcome our colleagues here. If you want to join me, there is Ed, hello, and Miriam and Jan is going to join too. I really look forward to your conversation. We decided that we would start with 3 short introductory statements of each of you, and Ed will begin. I will come back later to all of you to get the questions from our audience to you. And with that, Ed, please go ahead.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm really delighted to be here with all of you. Miriam, a former colleague at Indiana University, and Jan and I have been partner in arms at course on 9/11 and American memory at the museum for many, many years. I looked at the list of memorial dilemmas that I thought I would talk about. Those of you who have read the little intro things, and it's, like 2 hours worth of thinking about all kinds of case studies. So I want to start broadly and come back to some of these other things during our conversation. I think this is an incredibly interesting time, and I'm thinking here mainly about the historical and memorial landscape of the United States, because that's what I know best. And I would be very interested to hear more about European landscape. I think this is a tremendously interesting, dynamic time of change, of revision, not only with controversies, important discussions, removal of Confederate memorials, but to look at the range of remembrance now, who gets to count in history, labor sites, women's sites, sites of what I call their indigestible stories. The Sand Creek Massacre site, now a part of the National Park Service, memorializing the horrific event of 1864 when a friendly group of Cheyenne were massacred, mostly women and children. I think the US has expanded in exciting ways who counts in the telling of history, what counts in the telling of history, telling indigestible stories. Sites of lynching are now memorialized by various groups. So it's an exciting kind of time. I also think about sites that are traditionally popular to visit in the United States, like Gettysburg, for example, one of the turning points of the American Civil War in July 1863, and one of my very, very favorite public history books that's been out for a while now by Margaret Creighton, The Colors of Courage, Gettysburg's Forgotten History, Immigrants, Women, and African Americans in the Civil War's Defining Battle. And one of the beauties of her book, and a great example of really good revisionist history, is to introduce a set of characters that usually don't occupy prime real estate in the telling of the story of Gettysburg. Because, as she points out, for these groups, it was not just a 3-day event. And I would just like to read you a little snippet, one of my favorite parts of Margaret's book. When we measure Gettysburg by the yardstick of women's work, the battle's geography shifts distinctly. The circumference of battle expands beyond the familiar cemetery and seminary ridges to include both the borough and the civilian farms for miles around. Seen from the vantage point of civilian women, the battle's chronology also changes. The trauma lengthens from 3 days worth of killing to at least 3 months worth of recovery and administration. Viewed through the lens of the African American experience in Pennsylvania, the Battle of Gettysburg expands again, becoming both a momentary explosion in 1863 and the climax of decades of threats from below the Mason-Dixon line. It's a battle all about, utterly about freedom. I think that's a wonderful way to sort of shift our focus as we think about these events. And it brings me to one of my pet peeves, and that is the misuse of the term revision or revisionism. Initially, this was a nasty term to be associated with Holocaust denial, but people call it Holocaust revision. And I'm sure all of us have heard many, many people use this term in a negative way. Well, that's revisionist history. And my response is, well, of course it is. We don't tell the story of George Washington according to Parson Weems anymore. There's no other area of our life where we use the term revision in this way. If you go to a doctor and they don't put leeches on your arm, none of us recoil in horror and say, oh, that's medical revisionism. Historians, by definition, are involved in a conversation which we ask new questions, new materials become available. People look at things from different vantage points. So I think the term revision needs to be sort of relaunched and used correctly. How that happens, I really don't know. But I mean, think about the scholarship of the Holocaust, and now the incredible new work that's being done on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. I think of Jeff Weidlinger's work in the midst of civilized Europe, talking about the pogroms of 1919 to 1921 in the Ukraine as sort of foreshadowing what comes later. Were Jeff to bring this work into his classes, as a former colleague at IU, now at Michigan, of course he's revising our understanding of the Holocaust. So I think what we're seeing now is a dynamic historic memorial landscape going through all kinds of interpretive revision that I think is very exciting. And I'm happy to get into some of the particulars that make memorialization, particularly of sites of violence, really, really difficult. But I'm going to stop there because I think I've almost kept myself to 5 minutes. A miracle for an academic, by the way. So that's it.
Shall I hop in, Ed?
Yeah, absolutely, Jan.
Okay. So I'm Jan Ramirez from the 9/11 Memorial Museum, and some of you, I'm sure, have been here. But just to give you the dates again, we are a museum about an event that really transpired visually in under 3 hours, but kind of for 2 decades has changed our geopolitics. We are doing our business at the actual wound site. So that is 8 of the 16 original acres of the World Trade Center campus. And we have the term memorial in our name. It's the National September 11th Memorial Museum. And as a curator and historian, I have learned every day that is not a neutral descriptor for a museum. And one thing that my colleagues and I have become acutely aware of are the situational ethics of doing public history in the authentic site where people died and suffered. And if you're going to introduce the perpetrators, where you have to account for their crime, but are you going to, prosecute them at the place where people are also remembered? So it's a very challenging site. We were always, as a museum, we were green lighted to create a museum in 2006. So that was 5 years after the instigating event. And I will say that the core team that was brought on to do this project, many of whom are still on staff, we were all ourselves, vicariously still traumatized from 9/11. And I think that trauma was translated into our scripting of the experience. It was very hard to edit things out, because somehow to edit out a voice, to edit out a story, to edit out a thing that belonged to somebody was to somehow hurt all over again. And one of the greatest struggles we had as we were creating this experience was how to end it. The 9/11 itself is an event full, certainly in the early years, fraught with misfacts and confusion. It was an extremely confusing event occurring in the sky, on the streets, in the buildings, off stage at the federal level. And, it took us years just to kind of sort out the morning itself. But no sooner had we opened in 2014, which was after the memorial had been dedicated on the 10th anniversary, then we have struggled every day with the problem of aftermath. This is an event that was not 9/11 was not over on 9/11. We like to talk about the 9/12 values of compassion and unity and grit and courage, and all of that is true. But we have moved on from 9/12. We are on beyond 9/13, 9/14, 9/15. And here we are, in this big sort of Queen Mary sort of, passenger ship that doesn't move very quickly. It's very expensive to change exhibitry. And we're struggling now to think about, how do we change an ending that has eluded us? Because although COVID has come and created a new era of awareness, there are still many salient aspects of 9/11 that are unfinished. We haven't brought the detainees in Guantanamo to trial. We have not heard the Saudi story. We have not identified 40% of the victims. We have still people dying from 9/11. So the casualty count of collateral health deaths now has exceeded the number of people that are memorialized at the 9/11 museum. The other thing, and then I will stop, that I find very interesting and troubling and challenging and fascinating at the same time is that on TripAdvisor, visitors are told that the 9/11 Memorial Museum is the second top attraction that people should visit when they're in New York. And so what does it mean to be a memorial museum and be an attraction at the same time? And the kind of challenge of messaging, where your communications colleagues in your museum store want reductive, hopeful messages. And, the historical issues themselves, the pain and the confusion and the anger and everything that has been done in the legacy doesn't necessarily, reduce itself to a tote bag or to a coffee mug. So I look forward to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrea, for the introductions. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much, Ed and Jen. Jen, I can identify with many of the things you've said, although we represent very different institutions and in different contexts. And I give you a little bit of background because some of the Americans in the audience probably don't know our institutions because it's even newer than yours. The Munich Documentation Center for the History of National Socialism has opened its doors in 2015, which is 70 years after the end of World War II. So fairly late, 6 years ago. Why did it happen so late, and what is the context, and where are we located? So this is a museum it's next to the Amerikahaus. It's in the center of Munich, and it's in a spot which was an urban wasteland, although it was prime real estate. It's located near one of the most central and very beautiful 19th century squares in Munich, which had been used by the Nazis for their rallies, and was this was the part of Munich that was already transformed into what was supposed to become the vision of this city, which was supposed to be the birthplace of the movement, and in that sense, kind of like the ideal city of the dictatorship. The idea was to completely rebuild Munich in a way like Paris was rebuilt in the 19th century, but it never happened, of course. It never really materialized, but partly it was. And so this museum was built on an authentic site, on the historic spot of the former Brown House, the infamous party headquarters. And it's surrounded by buildings that used to represent the dictatorship and now are dedicated to the arts and culture. Right after World War II, one of them used to house the Amerikahaus, the Center of American Re-Education, and now they're dedicated to arts and music. There are still some remnants which are unsolved, which is sort of next to our museum. There is a ruin which used to be a so-called, there was two temples of honor. And these temples of honor were built for the victims of the regime that helped to sort of make the regime. Those were the victims that were killed in the 1923 coup d'etat. And these temples were destroyed they survived the war because they were well protected throughout the war, but they were destroyed by the Allies. But the remnants, sort of like the base, is still there. These are, of course, very problematic sites because they're called temples of honor, and they used to honor the Nazi heroes. They were sort of the memorials of the regime, and those are places which are really, really sort of like problematic in order to sort of what do you do with that? And they're kind of these ruins are still there, and they represent this problematic memory. But in a larger context, why was this museum built so late? This is, of course, connected to the fact that Germany in general took a long time until it came to terms with the past, with the Nazi past. Basically, in the late 1970s, well, there is a differentiation between East and West Germany, but talking about West Germany, in the 1980s, there was a big change. And then, of course, with German reunification, a lot of memorial sites were built, like the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, for example. Also, the Jewish Museum in Berlin has its own dedication to the Holocaust and to Holocaust memory. These were the sites that were built in city centers. Other sites that existed before were the former concentration camp sites. They were turned into museum spaces and memorial spaces before, but they were, of course, always in remote places. You always had to go there on purpose. You would not stumble upon them, pass by these places when you go through a city. So it took time until this memory, sort of this traumatic memory, entered the city centers. And in Munich, it took really a long time because Munich, in a way, sort of, had problems in coming to terms with this past. And only after Berlin became a center of memory of the Holocaust and Nazi dictatorship, Munich decided that this would happen too. And as many of those sites in Germany, these happened because there were private initiatives. There were groups of people who advocated for transforming a specific historic site into a museum space or a memorial space. So that's kind of the larger context. And when the museum opened in 2015, with a permanent exhibition focusing on the specific legacy of Munich, the hope was, or the idea was, that in a way, 70 years after the war, this is a history that can be told with a distance. And although it's not closed, there is, we found our way in talking about it, in teaching it to the next generation and so on. But at the same time, the experience we're making is that this is a history which is also unfinished. Although most of the perpetrators are not alive anymore, many of the survivors are also not alive anymore. Some still are, and they can still tell their story. But the big problem, of course, is that the ideology is still alive. And this is something that Germany experienced, especially around 2015, when 1 million refugees arrived in Germany and a far right-wing party entered the parliaments. And I think that we all realize that this is an ideology which sort of like became more and more mainstream, and we thought we were done with it, but we did not, or we are not. And we can see that, of course, throughout Europe and the world, that this is something that still has a reality. So on one hand, we're dealing with a history that is 75 years and more ago. On the other hand, people ask us about a reality that they are struggling with, and they ask about racism, about anti-Semitism, and about neo-fascist groups. So what we're trying to do, apart from our permanent exhibition, is to address these topics in temporary exhibitions, but also to bring in a different approach. The permanent exhibition is a historical exhibition which is really fact-based and wants to educate people in a more traditional way. And I think that's good because, of course, we're in a post-factual world. Facts are important and knowledge is important. And there's less and less knowledge about this time. But on the other hand, a more personal, individual approach, a more emotional approach, working with younger artists, for example, or discussing topics like, the history and legacy of survivors, bringing in survivors' testimonies and so on, opens up the discourse and brings in new audiences. This is something that we've noticed, that Germany is an immigrant country. So what about all these people who live here and whose families haven't been living here in the 1930s or 40s? And either they have no connection with this history or from a different angle, because maybe they lived in a country which was threatened by German invasion or which was somehow connected to World War II on another level. So we're trying to open up this discourse. And one of the challenges that we see is the question is sort of like, who will be the future experts? With the survivors kind of like becoming more and more silent or older or not wanting to tell their stories anymore, who will be younger experts who can take on this legacy and this job? And another thing that is really important for us, or that we discuss a lot, is the question of transnational memory culture, because often we think about memory in a national context only. But on the other hand, for example, the history of Holocaust memory is one of these examples where you see how important the transnational aspect always was, because Germany really entered this discussion, or sort of the Holocaust became a subject in Germany only through an international influence from Israel, and especially from the United States, with the Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the TV series Holocaust, which almost everybody in Germany describes as a really important moment. And on the other hand, we see today that American museums approach us and ask us about our expertise in dealing with trauma and traumatic histories. So, for example, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, when it was opened, Brian Stevenson told the story that he went to Berlin and he saw the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and he saw the sort of the German way of dealing with the traumatic past, that is a past of guilt and not a past of some patriotic history or victory or nationalist narrative. So this exchange is something that I think is really important, has always been important, but is also important right now, and is kind of crucial in the problems and the challenges we're facing. Thank you. That was my initial statement.
Yeah. Your comments, Miriam, are making me think about my experience being immersed in the story of the Oklahoma City bombing, 1995, and thinking about how this community dealt with trauma in part through a very interesting memorial process. And family members of those murdered and civic-minded members of the community came together in a task force. Survivors eventually joined as well. And it was incredibly difficult because these are people in the midst of, intense grief, angry, of course, but trying to come together to work on this memorial process. And what I found really fascinating and inspiring was that over a long period of time and incredible patience by everyone, and some very, very painful moments, family members, survivors came to realize that while maybe each of them wanted something specific for the memorial, right? There were 168 victims. So, well, I want 168 trees. I want 168 hearts. I want 168 candles, so forth and so on. And they were, solid in that belief, because some people believe that, okay, this is the only artistic form that can express, my love for my murdered loved one. But what became apparent is when you have so many people entrenched in their own, it's not going to happen. And so gradually the process moved people to a kind of wider vision of what the memorial could be. And it was, to my mind, this incredible performance of the arts of democracy at work, where people look to a larger goal, realizing that the memorial was more for coming generations than it was for them. And I thought it was really fascinating that this community in Oklahoma City, without any so-called experts, leading the way, came to this. And it's an absolutely, in my mind, stunning memorial, and I think reflects how having survivors and family members involved in these kinds of things can be a very rich experience. Anyway, that sticks with me a lot.
I would love to just jump in to the subject of stakeholders. So we had, I had honestly really never been familiar with the term until I took this job. And we weren't open to the public for 7 years. And arguably the public is the beneficiary of the process. But for 9/11, there were a diversity of stakeholders who entered the story differently, who had suffered differently, who wanted different things. And our one of our first acts as a new institution was to set up a advisory committee of 90 stakeholders, more or less, 10 from here and 10 from there. And we actually had to set aside, I would say it was at least 2 years for them at these meetings to be in a situation where they could actually learn to hear each other and to enter the experience of the other group that they had never managed to think about through their own pain. Whether it was, of course, family members, bereaved relatives, but Lower Manhattan residents who had run for their lives and hadn't been back into their homes, in some cases in months or years, came home to dead pets, felt so unsafe and still feel very invaded by tourists that come to the 9/11 museum. I mean, there were many more, but I think you've really hit it, Ed, and which is that, your stakeholders need to find themselves in the story. It needs to ring true to them, but they are not your audience. The audience is the public. And in our case, we were quite familiar with probably what the Northeast community of the United States may have experienced on the day of 9/11 and the days that followed. What we didn't know about was the international chemistry that was going to happen in our site when we started having visitors from all over the place, everywhere internationally, who were bringing their own experiences of trauma and terrorism to this American baptism, so to speak, in a form of foreign terrorism that no one had seen coming, which is another story unto itself. And one of the things, it's fascinating to watch what's happened at the outdoor memorial, which people can access, for free. It's not a paying experience. Is that although we had 90 nationalities represented in our victim population of about 3,000 people, there are constant American flags being put in those names out there. There were people on some of the planes and in some of the buildings, who were just accidental visitors to the United States that day. They were here on business. They in no way identified with this country or its policies necessarily, and now they have posthumously sort of been Americanized, which is really interesting thing to see as well. And it was, we always try to say, the World Trade Center. And so we try to live up to the DNA of the place itself. But the stakeholder stories, and the other thing I would say is, just because an institution opens doesn't mean the stakeholders lose interest. If anything, they pay more attention. And the stakeholders, again, who are not our visitors, remain our moral compass, and they remain our jury. They're very quick to let us know when they feel we've made a mistake.
Yes, that's an experience we're making too, because of course we're also connected to other sort of later experiences of terrorism in Germany. For example, Munich had, there were several far-right attacks in the past 40 years. One of them at the Oktoberfest some 40 years ago. One of them more recently, 5 years ago, in the summer of 2016, there was an attack, and the victims were mainly teenagers. And these are very painful experiences that people are making. And in some cases, for example, with the teenagers that died in the OEZ-Attentat, many of their families had migrant background. They were from Roma and Sinti families. And there was a big disappointment in the state, how the state reacted, because this attack hadn't been recognized as a far right attack right away. It more estranged the people from German identity than it brought them closer, because it was, these are sort of like not that prominent moments, but people feel that they're left alone in their sadness. And there are great memorials that have been, colleagues who work here in the city of Munich who did great projects involving the people into a process. But the closer it gets to actual problems, with racism in a society, with the division of a society, the more problematic it gets to find a good way, sort of as an institution, as an educational institution, as a museum, to involve people on an appropriate level. Because the most important thing is that people get a voice and get to be heard, especially groups that usually sort of, yes, it's a democratic process, but of course democracy has people with stronger voices and other people whose voices are never been heard. So one of the challenges is to kind of find a way of sort of moderate this process to make these people's voices heard. But it's of course an ongoing challenge that I think involves many levels of society, not only museums. Of course, there is a political responsibility, and there are many other aspects to it. But of course, these many experiences of trauma after terror attacks are, I think, very challenging for institutions like ours.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm thinking now. I'm thinking now again about Oklahoma City and how acts of political violence were turned into illness narratives. And there were a number of family members and survivors in Oklahoma City who resented being treated as victims of trauma, suffering from an illness, and then like the sort of new high priests of the culture, trauma experts would help them sort all this out. And so one psychiatrist in Oklahoma City who really resented the so-called trauma experts for descending on Oklahoma City said something really interesting to me. He said, people begin to inhabit the diagnoses they're given. And there were a fair number of people affected by the bombing who angrily rejected this and turned to activism of different kinds, who turned to the arts as a response to this. And I found that really, really interesting because the therapeutic story, even in what's called the Buckle of the Bible Belt in Oklahoma City, the therapeutic narrative was everywhere. Even in terms of how people chose to grieve, that if grieving became too emotional, professionals immediately went to get the needles. It was quite fascinating to think about this, and yet there was, of course, lots of traumatic impact. I titled my book "The Unfinished Bombing: Oklahoma City in American Memory," and it remains unfinished for lots of people. Just as Jan talked about how 9/11 lives on among the thousands of people affected now by illness. Miriam, I wanted to ask you before I forget. I'm thinking back to the really interesting controversies over the Wehrmacht exhibition, and I'm wondering if that story and maybe what are the most challenging narratives that you guys have to deal with? Are there just really indigestible stories that a significant number of people refuse to acknowledge because it's so subversive of personal identity?
Well, with the Wehrmacht exhibition, which was a big sort of, that was a change of discourse. There were several, but that was a very dramatic change of discourse in talking about the Holocaust, because it created a much larger group of perpetrators. So we started in 1945 with the idea that, there were the big guys, and the big guys were put on trial and fine, we're done with it. And there was a lot of continuation in Germany, in many jobs, in, whether in the courts or in the hospitals or in politics, there was a lot of continuation, and people who had been quite influential in the Nazi dictatorship continued to have a good life and have a voice in the society after 45. And then gradually the group extended, and there was sort of, seeing more responsibility, but it was not extended until the Wehrmacht exhibition involved the big group of every German who went to the army could have been a perpetrator, and many were. And this was a moment that was extremely emotional. It's well documented in a movie by an Austrian filmmaker.
Yeah.
And it was very emotional because many people couldn't talk to their fathers or uncles anymore because they had died or they had refused to talk about it, or even the former soldiers themselves had conversations or fights in this exhibition. And one would say, no, this was not how I remember it. And the other one would say, look, you know exactly, this is how we experienced it. So these heated controversies are a thing of the past because of, you know, there's simply more time has passed since then. The bigger controversy that there were certain controversies before our center was opened, you know, involving people in Munich who would fear that the legacy of their fathers or grandfathers was questioned with our exhibition. Because it's so detailed. But I think the big challenge that we're facing nowadays is it's a little bit like in the United States, when a couple of years ago, there was a research done that said most Americans don't even remember or don't even know what Auschwitz was anymore. So it's not as bad here. But one of the challenges is that, for example, many kids think that their ancestors had been part of the resistance movement. So if we would look at these numbers, then basically 80% of Germans were in the resistance movement, which they weren't, because there were only, I think less than, 1% or so. So there is a lot of identification with the victims and with the histories of the victims, which for a long time hadn't been told. But let's say since the 1990s, the stories of survivors are much more central, and there are Holocaust survivors who go to schools, who tell their story, and some of them still do, which have been extremely influential. And the perpetrators are less important. Sort of the perpetrators are less in the center. And also, you know, whatever is in between, sort of this large group of society who somehow profited from the regime, who was affirmative of the regime, members of the party, and so on, but who were not actual perpetrators or not sort of like the big perpetrators. So these stories are more complex, the gray zones. And now in the third and fourth generation, we see that there are more people. For example, there's a German artist, Nora Koch. She lives in New York and she teaches at the Parsons School for Design. And she did an illustrated edition of Tim Snyder's On Tyranny, and we have that now as an exhibition in our museum. And she did before that. She did basically a family memory. She's talking about her family and about her family story, and they were not perpetrators. They were just regular people who participated a little bit and profited a little bit, and so on. But she tells it with an emotional distance that is very helpful to makes this story really accessible. And there are others in this generation who do that. And I think this is a new tendency, which is extremely productive, because we can talk about the perpetrators in a different sense. And also there are some grandchildren of famous perpetrators who go to schools also and talk about their experiences growing up as the son or daughter of a prominent Nazi war criminal. So I think that these experiences are extremely important for not only for children, but for all sorts of people to see what it means on a very personal level. Yeah.
Jan, similar question.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, I think when we started out our process before we were open, we created this document called flashpoints. We were anticipating where we were going to have pushback and, you know, tripwires with our stakeholders and potentially with the press and potentially with the public at large. And, you know, we were fairly clear on our rationale for doing certain things. And one of the things, of course, we were going to identify the perpetrators of 9/11. We spent about 2 years getting much deeper into the individual stories of, how these individuals were radicalized, where they trained, how they came to know each other, the literal DNA of their time in the United States. Muhammad Atta's suitcase, which was pulled off the luggage ramp at Logan Airport, being, really the smoking gun that kind of explained a lot to the investigators. But in the end, we backed off that and went back to, we must identify them because, of course, this was not a tsunami. It was not a natural event. It was, it was premeditated murder, and found that all of the things we thought were going to be big issues were not the big issues that we thought. Once the museum opened, people could come and judge for themselves. They may not have, they may have liked it, they may not have liked it, but they could judge for themselves. Our biggest problem, since opening, is the ongoing things that have been done in the name of 9/11. Whether the war on terror and how that ended, politics, make America great again. I mean, this has been, it is, as you've called it, Ed, the problem of aftermath. America's mayor, for example, is somebody that, of course, figures into the events of the day and the very, very challenging months that followed, and then went on to, have a career that took him elsewhere. So it's the aftermath that has really the longer aftermath that has been difficult for us to kind of really understand and harness. So that's, as my colleagues say, that's why God invented public programs and education departments, because actually our public program series does a lot, that the physical museum probably couldn't do. In terms of difficult questions that are answered, experts, diverse voices that are brought in. But I did want to mention one thing, and I think anyone who's been to the 9/11 Museum may be aware of, but one of the great moral barometers of our curation of the museum is the fact that we inherited the decision to bring the medical examiner's repository of unclaimed, unidentified remains to the memorial site. So the public doesn't have access to that facility. We don't, as museum, staff, have access to it. Family members do have access to it on appointment. But it is in literally the center, the hyphenating hall of the museum. It resides behind that. And here we are, 20 years after the fact. And as I mentioned at the start, we still have 40% of the victims in New York who were never physically identified with any traceable remains. So you can imagine the restlessness this creates for their families. They've never had the ability to go, kind of meaningfully through a burial or a cremation process. But because of the existence of the repository in the heart of the museum, really, this, I think, determines just how far or not far we can go in at least this generation of still active memory and pain, actively into the issues of the perpetrators and the complexity and grayness of what was done in the name of 9/11.
Yeah, I was wondering, this was one of the things I was thinking about, because of course, all our institutions, and you said that right now, Jen, we all have to do and deal with the history wars that are going on either side of the Atlantic, and in various states where we see that history is being used for nationalist projects, is being distorted, is being, even survivors, and this is something that happens in various countries in Europe where survivors' testimonies are being challenged because the stories they have been telling, for example, about, collaboration of non-German non-Germans in World War II are now being challenged since the survivors are not there anymore. And we as institutions have to always sort of like deal with that. And we often, in our institutions, just as you said, we are also dealing with it with public programs, with events, bringing in this diversity of voices, because this is something that you cannot provide as a museum yourself, sort of like, you know, to be this platform for democratic exchange, to be a platform for academics, artists, and others to interact and have a way of, you know, contributing to this discourse, which can only happen with, as I said in the beginning, sort of like with various experts, because we really, I feel like we really need them.
Do you both think that with the technology now to keep showing oral testimony, does this help in a climate in which you know, people want to sort of tailor facts and reality to their own wishes? Is this a way to sort of you know, put an anchor down in what we think of as historical reality?
Well, I'm going to say with 9/11, you know, we started in 2006, and as a curator, you know, you're sort of challenged. What are the first artifacts? You're always going to be judged on the first artifacts you acquire. So the first artifacts I think of, you know, the first three are the sky that everybody has a memory of. You know, out of the blue came this horrific event, you know, that ironically was a blue sky that was perfect for aviation that day. I think of emotion as being an artifact. Huge emotion, continues to be a huge emotion. And how you talk about 9/11, particularly, you know, the closer you get to where the pain was suffered. And then I think about the ritual of one's telling of one's story in connection to 9/11, you know, and we decided in 2006 that we would start an oral history program. And our colleagues, you know, who work in academic oral history said, you're too late. 6 years later, you know, nobody is really going to want to talk to you. That, you know, the important stories have been captured. And we found that, you know, people had not even begun to put language to their meaning making, if you could even call it that, you know, their experience. And to this day, although unfortunately interrupted by COVID, the oral history, the capture of first person testimony has been a big part of what we do. It's been a big part of what our collection intake. And we have found that our visitors, interestingly, even young visitors, you know, teens, or you know, middle school agers, they're very, very moved to hear people, everyday people like themselves, tell their story, to struggle for words, you know, to kind of struggle for meaning. And that has remained, you know, a fascinating aspect of our collection. It's also really interesting because it is primary. It's the primary voice, the primary witness. And when do we move beyond that and let people like Ed step in, you know, to actually curate a label at the 9/11 Museum that doesn't defer back to this primary witness? I think we're just at the threshold now, 20 years out from the event, where, you know, we are seeing a new generation, the born after generation. You know, you say to kids and sometimes young teachers today or young parents today, oh, 9/11, never forget. Well, what are they supposed to remember? They have no lived memory. So there is this kind of, these two tides are kind of now crossing or paralleling in how the story is told. There's this, you know, the generation who experienced it, whether they were here in New York or wherever they were. You know, as we've often said, Ed, we had about 2 billion, maybe 2/3 of the world's population in some way witnessed this event in real time on September 11th through television and radio and logging onto the computer. I mean, it's just the phenomenal sensory trauma of watching this spectacle unfold as the plotters intended but then we have all these kids that up till now 20-year-olds who have this is a distant event. This is history. This is not something that is recent to them.
Yeah, we're a little further down the road in this experience. in our context, of course, we're kind of like we're having the last of the survivors that are still telling their stories, who were children. For example, we work with a wonderful man. His name is Ernst Grube. He survived Theresienstadt, the camp, as a child, as a teenager, and he's going to be 90 years old next year, and he's still going to schools and tells his story, and even does it online. But of course, sort of like there are 4 generations who haven't experienced anything. We're talking about memory. And the beautiful thing is, for example, we have this group, and they're doing this performance. They started like in the summer, and they continue to do it. There are kids, teenagers between the age of 12 and 15. They developed a dance performance on his experience as a child, being in a camp together with other children here in Munich, from where they were then brought back to their parents, and then on to the concentration camp. And they did this beautiful dance performance, which was very emotional, but it was not about the emotions of that former child. It was about their own emotions in dealing with this history. So it was very personal about their situation now and today. It was not that they wanted to feel like the survivor they were talking to, but it was really sort of translating that into their own world today. And I think these are moments that are very precious, because this is exactly this kind of transition that is difficult to find. These moments, they're difficult to create, but then when they're being created, when there are people who take on this challenge and this responsibility and this endeavor, it's an amazing thing to see. Sort of, it's like this transformation of memory into something else, and putting it, sort of giving it on to the next generation.
Yeah. Thank you, Miriam.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, because we have one question that is somewhat related to what you were just talking about, this transition from visitors or groups that have experienced, were victims or related to victims, and then to the next generations. The question from one of our people in the audience is asking how you respond to young people taking selfies at your memorial sites with partially big smiles on their faces. Is this something that you want to or need to get used to, or are there ways and that you can or try to prevent this, or do you even want to prevent this? How do you deal with this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say in New York, selfie sticks aplenty, fortunately or unfortunately, on the outdoor memorial. And I have come from myself from being like, how can these people, do they know where they are? I mean, putting their toddler up on one of the parapets that could fall 30 feet down into it's crazy to me. But I've also come to understand people put themselves in history this way. They come with their selfie sticks. We're all conditioned to smile, when you see, and what's the worst thing would be that they're not there at all. They've made the decision to come and bear witness and make some kind of emotional connection with the site to begin with. We don't let selfie sticks in the museum. And it's been very interesting to watch, especially younger families and school groups coming in. And they've got their kind of energy and their sillies, and they've maybe been, high on popcorn and candy somewhere else when they come in. And as they move down 70 feet to bedrock, which is where the main galleries are, they on their own seem to sober up. It's a very fascinating thing to watch. I've worked in other museums where that doesn't happen. The kids are always kind of, agitated, but so we do see it outside. But I sometimes worry, like, as strange as it is, and we do have visitors who take on other visitors. They will stop a family and say, do you know that my son, my 32-year-old son, that's his name, and he left behind a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and a widow who never got up, but they've come. So I'm not sure how I personally feel, but we do let selfie sticks persist on the outdoor memorial.
Yeah, no, I think with our center it's a little different because, as I think I've mentioned, it's actually not a memorial. We're at the space of sort of the former party headquarters. So this is not a concentration camp memorial site. And for example, a couple of weeks ago, we had an art installation on our front square, and there were a couple of girls, and they were doing a TikTok dance. Yeah. And they were afraid when I watched them, they were afraid that I would say, "Can you please not do that here?" And actually, I was quite happy because they felt that they were part of this, and they owned it also in a way. They didn't feel driven away by the architecture or by, these kinds of institutions can be very, very irritating too. So I was actually quite happy about it. And also when groups are starting conversations in our exhibitions, I'm very happy because it's sort of the discourse is in the center for our museum. But I know that this discussion has been led a lot about the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which again is not at a site where people actually died, apart from the fact that people were persecuted all over Munich. They were persecuted all over Berlin. So in many ways, all of Germany is a site of remembrance. Yeah. So in that sense, this does play a role. And I think the important thing is sort of to remember, on one hand, of course, the persecution and the problematic past, but also, if you just think of sort of like what kind of country Germany would be if it hadn't sort of excluded, driven away, or killed all these people, it would be a completely different country. So to remember also this kind of diversity, we have, for example, monument near our center which remembers the book burnings, and it's done by a New York artist who lives in Berlin, Arnold Dreiblatt, and it lines up all the titles of books that were burned, and it remembers the diversity, the richness, the beauty of this country before all this happened. And this is sort of one of the things that is really important for us to show, to also remember, everything that has been there and it's not there anymore. And that invites, people to contribute to, if people usually don't make selfies at our center because it has a very somber architecture. So if they feel welcome enough to have a lively conversation, I'm very happy.
Yeah, I think the other fascinating thing, and Ed, you'll have something to say about this too with the Oklahoma City example, is somehow miraculously these symbols do emerge at our sites. One emerged at Oklahoma City, one emerged here at the World Trade Center Plaza, and that is this, in our case and in their case, a tree that survived, blasted out, shouldn't have survived. They saw that the bark was still green underneath. In our case, brought the tree, it was a calorie pear tree, out to a nursery, literally for triage for a number of years. And then it was brought back to the Memorial Plaza. And it is unlike any of the other trees, which are all swamp oak trees on the plaza. It bursts into bloom ahead of the swamp oaks. It's kind of, and it has grown, 6 or 7 feet since it's been here. It's flourishing with all of its gnarls and, wounds and so forth. And people cannot get enough of that story. That tree, they're hopeaholics. They have to find something, that emerged in the aftermath of these great homicides, mass homicides and traumatic incidents that was about renewal and resilience. And I think it's a human instinct. Survival is a human instinct, I would say. And I think when it's truthful, it's just wonderful. The thing I worry about as wearing a historian's hat is that it's the reductiveness of our history institutions, sometimes not because the curators or historians want them to be, but because they just, they have to be marketed. And that somehow in that reductiveness, we're making impossible goals for people. Let's say the goal of resilience. Who wouldn't want to be resilient? But honestly, not everyone is ever going to get there. It's going to be an elusive goal for many people. And we shouldn't hold it out to be the prize, you're passing the resilience mark and you get your name on a wall. I mean, because these kinds of events are such struggles for survivors and people that were directly affected, and they're all at their own pace. And I mean, I have a lot of interactions with survivors and family members to this very day, and it is ultimately a deeply personal journey. Some are helped, some are struggling, some haven't made it, some will make it maybe down the line, or they'll make it through the next generation. But I do worry about that reductivism, and I don't know about in Germany, but I see it happening way too much. We seem to not have been able to get our younger population to understand, to let contrasting narratives coexist, or to accept gray as the right color. It's not always this or that. Sometimes it's muddled, and it may remain that way.
Oh, I agree. This is so important what you're saying. It's and I think especially when it comes to the history of National Socialism, it's a lot about sort of the victim's narrative and the perpetrator's narrative, and then there are the gray zones, and especially when it comes to the perpetrator's history, these gray zones are so important, because otherwise we create these monsters that have come, I don't know, from out of space, created a dictatorship, and now they're gone. But that there is, a responsibility on so many levels, and what it means to, for example, there's this one quote by Hannah Arendt that I keep repeating because it really impressed me when she said in an interview that 1933 wasn't a shock for her because of the Nazis. She said, well, we knew what the Nazis were, but it was a shock about, what happened with friends, with colleagues, people, turning your backs to you, these acts of kindness or of refusing kindness. Or refusing empathy, or refusing, just to see people, to notice them in a city. So these gray zones that are so difficult to explain, and also, as you said, there are ambivalent histories, and there are sometimes contradictory narratives. And that makes it very complicated. And yes, we have the same problem. Many of those complicated parts are not part of the narrative in the exhibition, because we feel that we cannot expect it from visitors to deal with that. And maybe it's right. I think in some ways, yeah, we're right in that. We shouldn't overwhelm people. But on the other hand, I think we can trust people to deal with gray zones or with ambivalent histories. But it's an ongoing discussion, of course.
Right.
I want to give Ed the chance to respond too. I have a few more questions, so maybe we'll
quickly. Yeah. For me, one of the real benefits of the oral histories that we have is it allows people to inhabit personal stories of others, and extraordinarily powerful oral histories at 9/11 at Jan's place, very powerful ones at Oklahoma City, powerful ones now at numbers of different sites. I guess the other thing that I think about is trusting the power of the story. When we were working on and I was just on a committee that was a conversation partner in this. I wasn't doing any like really substantive work, but for the visitor center at Flight 93, which is an incredibly powerful site. And the visitor center, I think, has done really well. It's outdoors. But the Park Service said, well, visitors will experience, and when visitors go to, they would, and I, so I got, since I'm old and cranky anyway, I got old and cranky and I said, you guys have no business trying to marshal emotion. I mean, you just don't. Trust the power of the story. And I think that's the case. When you open up a story like the Holocaust in a huge museum, or I think Jan will probably agree with 9/11, you're going to have people with all kinds of reactions, some of which are going to be troubling. I'm absolutely sure that there are neo-Nazis that have gone through the Holocaust Museum, right? And maybe said, damn, I wish they could have finished the job. Well, okay. I mean, if you want to keep the story safe, then you keep it as the ownership of particular people, right? And you ghettoize it. If you're going to open it, in this case, to the American public, you're going to have all kinds of reactions. You're going to find chewing gum in the shoes and candy wrappers in the shoes, and things that you would, never dream about. So, this is what happens when history becomes public history.
I love it how you. Sorry, I love it how you are able to talk about these things after a question about selfie sticks. Thank you so much. I have a couple of more questions that I want to get in here, and one is very much related to what you all were just talking about. I'm just going to read this. There is a lot of talk about how stakeholders feature in the work of these memorial institutions. In this context, I would like to ask participants what their views and experiences are on what could be called citizen sciences in the memory work. We see this with COVID collections happening now, but if I remember correctly, the 9/11 Digital Archive was one of the first projects of the so-called Rapid Response Archives. Maybe Jan, you want to start?
Yes, I mean, that happened before this institution existed, but it was the first, as far as I know, effort, and it came out of two academic partners joining to capture, the spiraling digital conversation in response to 9/11 and these exceptional artifacts from, trails of messages from one friend to the next, all, and you track the message around the world, how are you? Are you okay? What about your aunt who lived on such and such a street? To these very initial lists of survivors or people who they thought they saw someone somewhere that were the first way, loved ones could kind of check online to see if maybe somebody in fact got out, but was, in a coma somewhere. Countries that, put up for the first time a digital book, a guest book on their websites, for people to sign to. I mean, it's just extraordinary. And I would say, so yes, absolutely. The digital footprint and response around 9/11 was phenomenal. And that particular project, which is now, I believe, at the Library of Congress, is exceptional. Remember, however, on 9/11, there were no digital cameras in phones. In a way, thank God, because I can only imagine how many people would have, stop to take unnecessary pictures. Those didn't arrive in the shelves of most of our, retail stores until about four months later or so. But just the visual record alone is so huge. But the citizen journalism piece of, everyone who grabbed a camera, whatever type of camera it was, or an image making device, that is actually the strength of our visual collection. It's not the professional photographers from whom we've licensed materials. It is the everyday citizen who donated, a camcorder, video that he or she made, or a sort of an incredible shot from a Kodak, throwaway camera that they ran into Dwayne Reed to buy. I mean, this is this phenomenal citizen journalism that is now so much a part of the world we live in. But I would say it really starts at the start of the 21st century with this event of 9/11.
Yeah, but I would say it's really interesting because we've been thinking about this a lot, sort of in a more historical perspective, because we're preparing an exhibition together with the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, and they're hosting this amazing collection of the Emanuel Ringelblum archive. He was a Jewish historian in the Warsaw Ghetto, who together with a group of relatively young people started a collection of documenting Jewish history before the ghetto, but also documenting the ghetto in every aspect, whatever they could do. They hardly had any cameras, but they were collecting everything, candy wrappers, or, tram tickets, or whatever they could find, but also the first testimonies, people who wrote letters, who draw images of their children they lost, and so on. And it was really a moment which is, it's interesting, of course, for the content, but it's also interesting as a project of documenting a traumatic experience, and sort of being in the middle of a history that is completely overwhelming because it's so disastrous and so violent, but starting to have this kind of documentation, and in a way starting a way of introducing a new way of making this combination of activist / historian / journalist of your own history, which became so influential throughout the 20th and 21st century. But also, sort of in a different respect, I was thinking of that. We're opening a second site, which is on a former forced labor camp, which is still intact, and it's interesting in the respect that it's being used as studios for local artists and for children's institutions, and the people who are using these barracks, apart from the 2 barracks that we will be using for our museum, are part of this process. And they're contributing to whatever is happening, and that is something new, and it's of course much more complicated because usually, kind of like, you start an institution and you have people contribute on to a collection, to something, but they're basically contributing with their presence and their history. So I think that this is a very, very important aspect of our work.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And anything to add, or shall I? Okay. Another question we received is about in how much do you consider the origin of your audience? So is there a difference in creating a memorial site or museum or an exhibition for a national versus an international audience? How much can you pay attention to that, and what would be differences, or how do you?
That's a good question. Well, in our case, I mean, it started out. We just claimed the name, by the way. We claimed the name, the National September 11th Memorial Museum. Nobody ever told us we couldn't have it. Congress never came and said, "Oh, you're the national." We sort of had to grow up into the shoes of it, and certainly it's a story told from the perspective of an unprecedented attack on the United States. So, the locus is the United States, and then in particular, these particular sites of horror. But it happened to, people of 90 different nationalities. And because New York has always been sort of an international, or, certainly in this century, very much an international center for business and media and fashion and, whatever, we were very aware from the beginning that our audience was likely to be that. So we tried to consult with the city's tourism bureau, actually, to say what are the 6 most requested languages for translation, when people go out and about. So we have audio tours you can get in those languages. Of course, we always hear from the 7th or 8th language group, why don't you have, you can never, and they're expensive to do. So there was that sense. But, what I think we didn't know, and part of the fascination has been people that do come from other countries and other experiences of trauma, whether it's terrorism or some other, war event. And they come and they seem to be very moved by the story of 9/11. They're very also fascinated that America was so ill prepared to kind of cope initially, that, that they're fascinated in the American response. Just as they are empathetic towards the individuals who, everyday people that were just caught in the vortex of this thing. So I think as, we get further, and by the way, the last year and a half, we've very, very much missed seeing visitors who are not, just from the New York metro area, which has never been really the audience that comes to the 9/11 museum to begin with. But we learn from our visitors. They're very vocal. They engage with our visitor hosts, our docents. They point things out. They're very active online, sending in, forms to us to let us know when we got a fact wrong, or that, had we thought about this. So I'm very, always very touched by the level of engagement.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's very interesting to hear. Our museum was, of course, I think in a way designed for the city's population, to deal with the city's past. And I think the first visitors who came were all from Munich. But then very quickly, this, of course, shifted to an international audience, and also to a more diverse German audience. And I think this is sort of the more, challenging question in many ways. Because, of course, Munich is always associated with National Socialism. One of the things we have to deal with is that there are these kind of freelance tours, especially for Americans, which we haven't seen much lately, but they're coming back, and they're sort of sloppy, they call the Nazi tours, and they're just outdoor tours, and people are taken from one side to another, and they always end up in front of our center. They cannot enter as a tour, but I always hear all sorts of weird anecdotes about famous Nazis, and it's kind of like it's a very kind of like popular and even populist endeavor. It's like people are being told stories they want to hear. I think it's one of the challenges that, as I think Jenny said that at the beginning, like you become a tourist site, and especially in your case, this is a site of extreme violence, of a site of death. But at the same time, you're sort of like Google has you as a tourist site, and you're and of course sort of like you have to deal with that. I think one of the things that I think in New York is very obvious, sort of as many people come to New York who were not born in New York, were not born in the United States, sort of like want to become New Yorkers, identify with the city, and then identify also with its past, even if they were not around with 9/11. 20 years ago, but they remember maybe or so. And so there is this wish to become part of this history. But on the other hand, there's of course also history wars going on in the United States and also here, sort of whose stories are being told and whose stories are not being told, and so it's a very complex process, and I think it's really important to include people in a way, as I said before. Sometimes it's sort of like by inviting artists who represent a different narrative, a different story. We open up our sort of like our portfolio or our language in a way, the terms we're using, and then people feel more. I notice that suddenly people feel more welcome than if you just tell them, look, this is our story, and now come, we invite you to come. But if you have, someone who speaks a different language, who addresses people with different symbols, different aesthetics, then suddenly people feel like, oh yeah, we're part of this story. We're part of this, this center, this museum is part of our story. And I think this is one of the challenges that I find most interesting right now at this moment, sort of like, with this combination of sort of global, local identities and the fights that are going on for many people in many people's lives.
Yeah. Well, other than, of course, the victims, the actual people, who were killed on the day or escaped from the buildings on the day, we usually hear from people complaining that they're in the story, but we haven't recognized them. They want into the story, which I think means that's a very positive thing. People are finding themselves somehow in this story of the everyday seat of the pants smarts and courage of people to step up and do something. And, the thousands and thousands of people who, like, white blood cells came to the wound site to help heal. They want to be in the story. And, we hear from them. I've just stumbled into the world of emergency massage therapists. Who knew? But it turns out they came, they got organized. They had particular sites where they'd go, they'd massage people that, refused to take off their bunker gear or did because they were just utterly exhausted, but they want to be recognized, as being part of this history. So, we usually hear from people who want in. And I think that says something about this history, that it's a very porous, democratic. It happened, in a dense, populated, diverse city, at this particular time, and people want in because they see something about what they did, or their neighbor did, or their father did, or their cousin did, that they need validation that they're part of this story. And I do think that's a very positive thing. I think that's a positive force. So
I'm thinking about in Oklahoma City. When Oklahoma City took place, we were already with CNN and other news bureaus that were totally international. Excuse me. How I want to say, how that enfranchised people to think of themselves as part of this event, even though they lived a million miles away. It allowed people to connect in ways that were really inspiring and moving, and also troubling. You had people from all over, sending money to people in Oklahoma City, declaring that they had fallen in love with so-and-so who appeared to do an interview. And you had people entering into other people's lives in ways that you would never do in your own hometown. None of us would like be walking by a church service, a funeral service or whatever, and go into the church and start, well, I think you should do this hymn, and I think these flowers would work better, and so forth and so on. And yet people were entering into people's lives in very invasive ways. So I think the media enfranchised people from all over the world to become involved in this kind of business. Yeah.
We sometimes call it the mascot tendency, you know, where it's usually a media that has found a story and found someone very willing to tell their story, and the story gets told over and over, so it becomes the default story, as if there's only, you know, one particular story. And it's, you know, we have to mix it up. I mean, it's hard to get people. We have people that come to the 9/11 memorial to touch the particular name of one of the Flight 93 passengers, because his agency with the term "let's roll" is believed to have, you know, come specifically from this one individual. And so you see that on the bronze parapet, that name has been rubbed a lot more than the other names. There's no real valid way to verify that, you know, because it was all told through a third party kind of, you know, phone operator who's telling the story. But, you know, we see still the ways people come in will interact with particular stories of victims that had particular tread with the media.
Well, I could listen to your thoughts and stories much longer, but our time has come to an end. I had a question on you know, how do you deal with audiences who are living amongst fake facts and fake news, and how can they distinguish between that and what they see in your sites, which is reality or real history? There are many more questions. We also had another question from the audience. I think it shows that the interest in your institutions and in your research is definitely huge. And I want to thank you for making time for all of us today, for the audience in the United States. Thank you, Jan, for joining us. Thank you, Miriam and Ed, for coming together. This has been a great get together tonight, but also earlier. So thank you very much. I want to thank again my colleagues at the Bavarian American Academy for helping to organize this series. And I want to let our audience know that in 2 weeks, we have Take 3 on science denial and the role of the humanities, a transatlantic conversation. So join us for that if you wish to. And to our speakers here, thank you again. To the audience, thank you for your questions, and stay well and healthy. Good night.